Lovely. So good afternoon, everybody. We're here to talk about the integrated PMO model. Hopefully, you can see the screen, and I think Lindsay's just highlighted it, so that's kind of the primary view. But we've got a number of other people on the course on the session, and I suspect for the next few minutes, people will be joining now. You'll see already, if you open up your chat box or your kind of chat icon, there's a number of people who are already chatting in the chat. So I'm going to keep an eye on that as we go through the session today and pick up any questions. We've also got a number of other people on from the business. We've got Charles on from a sales perspective. We've got Jen, who people know, who does all of our support activities. And we've got Lindsay on as well, who'll be kind of prodding me if I'm missing some of the questions in the chat. So my name is Eileen Roding. I'm one of the directors of PMO Learning, and really excited to talk to you about this concept of the integrated PMO model. Now, this concept of the integrated PMO model, it's not necessarily new, but I think what's starting to happen now in different organisations, we're starting to see more than one PMO in different organisations. And when they come on a course, they kind of very often they don't talk to some of the other PMOs. So I just wanted to talk in a little bit detail about it, this integrated PMO model. So for those of you who don't know us, we're PMO Learning. We are a training organisation set up specifically to work with PMO people and help them deliver training internally to their PMO team, and perhaps support them with rolling out project management processes to their various teams. One of the good things about us is we're not one of those organisations who kind of lets you sit there all day on training without getting involved. We're very interactive, and any of the trainers that you have on our training courses will be PMO experienced, and a lot of our PMO trainers actually are still working actively in a PMO, so you'll get some real support. So today's session, there's a couple of things we're going to just cover off. We're going to talk about the integrated PMO model and what some of the benefits might be of having that integrated PMO model. And then we're going to look at just a few kind of tactical moves that we can make to start building that integrated PMO model, both from a top-down but also from a bottom-up perspective. So I just want to go back to kind of a little bit of theory that's mentioned in the PMO competency framework that recognises that PMOs tend to do some different things, and they support different levels of activity in the organisation. So first off, you've got those those PMOs that support projects, and it could be one project or multiple projects. What we see there is the kind of the definition of a project office, specifically a project office that is there to support an individual project. And what will happen is that project is set up at the beginning of the project, and when the project closes, the project office shuts down. Similarly, from a program perspective, when a program is set up, we'll set up a program office, supports it through the life of the program, and then when the program finishes, the program office shuts down as well. Then we've got a portfolio level, typically at a permanent office that sits at the top of the organisation structure and looks after, or primarily we've found, does reporting across all of the projects that sit across the organisation. And then we've got another permanent office that actually is a centre of excellence that develops all of the standards and all of the kind of the templates and processes and looks after the tools that we have across the organisation to support projects and programmes. And I think, you know, that works great in theory, and we have project officers and programme officers. But what we found is actually that office or department actually has a huge range of different names. And what I've just put up there is a number of the acronyms that kind of stand for project support office, or a project and program support office, a project and program management office, a change management office, and we've got all of those different kind of acronyms. And from a House of PMO perspective, which we kind of align our theory to, we have agreed that PMO is a collective noun rather than an acronym, and it represents any individual team or department that supports portfolio, program, and project delivery within an organization. Because very often some of those support activities are not necessarily done by somebody who sits in a PMO. They might be somebody who sits in finance, who does the finance reporting. There might be some people who sit in a HR function who support the delivery of kind of career paths, etc., for people who work in and around the project and program management. So from our perspective, we've kind of bought into this description of a PMO. One of the real difficulties that we find is that when people say PMO, it can mean so much to so many different people, and it shows itself in many different ways. So I just want to kind of go through a couple of examples of what a PMO might look like in an organization. So this is an organization where we've got one single project that's been kind of, the project manager has identified that actually a PMO is a good thing. And what they've done is they've got perhaps one person, we often call them a POO, a PMO of one, who is there to do lots of things to support that project manager in delivering that project. And very kind of much the kind of that program office definition, that project office definition, that at the end of the project, the chances are they might follow the project manager around because they've recognized that they need a PMO. And so, but as a whole, the organization, many of their projects and programs are not actually covered by any PMO at all. All of the reporting that's done tends to be done directly from the project managers themselves. And so the PMO function really doesn't exist as a business function. It really is just as a kind of a single person who supports one particular project. What may happen is where it's recognized that actually having support at the project level, there may be a group of projects who then have a group of people, and sometimes, to be fair, it might still just be one or two people who actually support all of the projects that sit within that particular department or division or even organization. But they're very much used to kind of individual short projects. All of the programs that happen in that organization tend to be strategic programs and are not supported by some of the processes and the templates that are created by this kind of small PMO that looks after the projects. Again, and I think this is kind of quite typical in organizations where they've been bubbling along, delivering kind of projects and perhaps a couple of programs, but they've got one big strategic program, and they've decided for this one big strategic program that they're actually going to pull together a program office and perhaps kind of look at some of the processes and templates that they need when delivering a bigger program. And when I first went to Cadbury Schweppes, this is what was happening. We were doing the largest program the organization had ever created, and we actually kind of pulled a program office together. And I know there's been a couple of organizations I've been working with where they've done the same. They've not really had any office that's been called a PMO, but they've pulled something together because they've got a large strategic program they want to deliver for their organization. You may have one particular department where actually the kind of the department head or the divisional head says, actually, I want to get a grip around all of the projects and programs in my department. And so in their particular area of the organization, they have got established their own PMO, but it's purely within their division. There's nothing elsewhere in the organization. And that individual kind of department manager or divisional manager has lots of kind of good things that they can get from having their PMO. So they've got a much better view of how much time and effort they're spending on projects versus how much time and effort they're spending on projects and programs. Perhaps they've got a much better view in terms of how they're going to hit their overall targets, because they've actually started to look at some of the benefits that are starting coming from the projects and programs. So this part of the organization can be seen to be kind of having much more management information and making better decisions in terms of where to invest their time. Now, as I was saying, there is sometimes a PMO set up at an enterprise level that actually kind of pulls together all of the projects and programs across the organization. And this is really interesting, because often what happens when the enterprise PMO is set up, where it covers all of the organization, particularly where it's a large organization, because of the amount of kind of time and effort that's involved, typically, yes, its primary purpose is to do reporting. So it doesn't necessarily get the time and effort to support individual projects and programs, doing health checks, or perhaps kind of supporting project managers in terms of doing kind of how they're doing risk management, or kind of working through in detail to make sure that a change actually kind of ripples through all of their baseline planning. So those enterprise PMOs do exist. They might cover everything, but perhaps have a limited set of services. What we also find is situations like this, where we've got PMOs that have been set up in different parts of the organization, because individual managers or individual departmental managers, as well as project or program managers, have identified the need for a PMO. Each of those PMOs is completely independent of each other, or doing their own thing, and doing, we're not suggesting they're not doing the right thing for their projects and programs, but potentially there's some overlap, and there's very little conversation between those two PMOs. And it's really interesting. We've sat in a number of courses where we've had conversations with some of the delegates, and they've go, oh yes, there are some other PMOs in the organisation. Don't actually know what they do, but I know they exist. And this is also an interesting situation we find, where actually an organisation has multiple PMOs, and each of the projects and programmes reports or provides information to the various PMOs, but nobody has an overall visibility of what all of those PMOs do, or what they do with their information. And so what that leads to is a number of what I would call kind of potential issues for that organisation to deal with. So what you've got is some kind of inconsistent methods and processes and systems that sit across the organisation. Now, this kind of works if you've got kind of individual PMOs where there's no overlap between the reporting or the information that's provided. But very often, those PMOs are all collecting some similar information. And what I've found in a huge number of organisations is that depending on where you get the information from, you potentially get a completely different perspective of what's happening on individual projects and programs. And so it becomes very difficult to actually provide any kind of consolidated information where we can actually do some, sometimes even program management, but primarily portfolio management becomes that real challenge, because we're trying to compare apples with pears, and the individual kind of projects and programs are trying to talk in different terms that the senior managers, quite rightly, are struggling to kind of connect with some of the other information that they've been provided with. And I think another challenge that we've got, where we've got a lot of disparate people around the organisation, is that it becomes very hard as a PMO individual working within that organisation to know where I can go internally in terms of developing my career, whether I'm going to get some new or some different experience, go to another part of the organisation or another PMO that kind of sits perhaps in that wider piece. So there are some kind of real kind of challenges that we're finding in the industry, you know, not just inside organizations, but actually across industry. There's still struggling for people to understand, for executives to understand, for senior managers to understand about what is it a PMO actually does. But also within that is also some mixed expectations around what a project can get or a program can get from a PMO. So, you know, if I'm a project manager and I'm delivering a project in one part of the organization, I then move geographically to another part of the organization, not only have I got some different processes and systems, the things that I had my PMO help me with, or suddenly kind of they disappeared. They're not services that that new PMO provides. And actually, they do a different kind of service, which I didn't realize I needed or wanted, but I'm actually having that forced upon me. So quite different, as I say, internally within an organization. And one of the things that it's really important is we're trying to get this kind of shared view of what a PMO can do and how a PMO can support and deliver value to the organization. So I think there are some kind of great benefits of actually kind of moving to an integrated portfolio model, about having this holistic approach to P3M support across the various departments, divisions, or across the whole organization. This ability to kind of reuse templates, processes, and documentation, and importantly, share knowledge, expertise, and resources across those PMOs. So just avoiding kind of that kind of potential overlap or gaps, but this whole kind of knowledge sharing element becomes really important. I was doing some delivery this week, and one of the challenges they've got is they're going through a reorganization, because apparently that happens in organizations every now and again. And what happens, they lose a lot of people with that kind of specific knowledge and expertise. So, you know, kind of trying to keep it in small silos across the organization is not really the most effective way to do that. So actually kind of having this kind of holistic approach allows us to share knowledge across the whole organization. But what is an integrated PMO model? I just want to kind of talk a little bit about what it is and what it's not before we perhaps look at some of the ways we can approach trying to develop one of those in our organization. So this is kind of a brief description of this integrated PMO model. It basically says we have lots of PMOs across the organization, but rather than those PMOs having just evolved and sitting disparately across the organization, somebody has taken an intelligent design and thought, actually, this is the best way we can provide support to the projects and programs that are delivered across the organization, that allows us the roll-up of information to actually be able to do effective organization portfolio management. Now, I think this is just a couple of things that are not necessarily evident from that picture, is just a representation. Just because we've got an integrated PMO model doesn't mean that every PMO manager reports to the PMO manager that sits above them. So just because I'm a PMO, I work in a project office PMO, or a project PMO, doesn't necessarily mean I report to the program PMO, which doesn't mean I report to the portfolio PMO. So we're not talking about a line management structure necessarily, though that is a possibility. What is really important is that we have a data flow that is managed and it's structured in such a way that we've got this single source of the truth that actually is presented in a way that can be consolidated, that provides an overall view of how that portfolio is delivering against the strategy. So in some PMOs, you might actually kind of have a reporting line up to the next one, and that might be the case for certain Project level PMOs might report into the program PMO, but the program PMO might actually report into the program manager rather than into the portfolio office manager. So just that's where we're trying to get to. So that integrated PMO model is a holistic, engineered, designed approach to how we're going to support project and program managers in their organization. And I think it's important to kind of go back to the textbook of, kind of what the key roles are that support that. So we'll start on the right-hand side. So the PMO director is typically the person who would look at that. They would work with the senior managers and look at that kind of, what does our organization need to deliver? How are we going to design the right number of PMOs across the organization? What is the reporting structure going to be? What's that going to look like in terms of the different services? And we're going to kind of come back to that in a moment. Importantly, the PMO manager is there and has autonomy within their PMO to actually set up and run and continue to work with their key stakeholders and transform, and potentially at some point close that PMO to support the local P3M delivery and capability. So again, that could be either at, sorry, that went the wrong way. That could be at enterprise level, it could be working at divisional level, or it could be even working at departmental level. It's hard to say on it's not even a Friday afternoon, on a Thursday afternoon. So the interesting thing from a top-down approach is that in a perfect world, in textbook land, we would want to start at the enterprise level. But we recognise that that's not always the case, because the people who recognise the value of a PMO may actually just sit at divisional level or a department level. So in a perfect world, what we're going to be looking at is actually the PMO director actually looking and talking to the PMO stakeholders and asking, well, what is it we're actually trying to achieve? What are your expectations of the PMO? And most importantly, how are we going to measure the success of the PMO? How do we know we're doing the right thing for the organization? And again, ideally, there's going to be a PMO director who actually kind of pulls that together. Realistically, that's not always the case. There is not always a PMO director in the organization. Typically, it'll be, if it's at a divisional level or a departmental level, it will be a PMO manager who has that conversation with those key stakeholders and pulls together a PMO vision. What is it you want the PMO to do? Why do you want the PMO set up? And that PMO vision has to be aligned to the corporate vision or strategy. Now, again, if we haven't got that sponsorship at a corporate level, this PMO vision can actually be aligned to the departmental strategy or the departmental targets and things that that particular department is actually trying to achieve. So as I say, ideally, it's going to be at that enterprise level. But if you're sitting there and saying, well, actually, this is only good for me, for my kind of department. I'm sitting here in the logistics department. We've got a PMO. I've been given the responsibility to kind of look across all of the logistics portfolio. This theory still applies. I can still look for a vision to say, well, what is it I'm actually kind of trying to achieve, and making sure that that's aligned to what the logistics department is there to achieve over the next 6, 12, 18 months. And then it's up to that kind of PMO director, that PMO manager, to actually develop a PMO service strategy that is aligned to that vision. So we've done some previous webinars on how to set that up for your organization. And I think the key thing is to start thinking about, well, actually, how can I get there from a divisional or a kind of a departmental level, from that kind of top down? And the important thing, I think there's two things that I think are really important when we're doing it from a top-down approach. So firstly, is this alignment and service of metrics. So if I've got a departmental PMO, I've been asked to look at how, kind of how we can support projects and programs in that particular department. I may have 3 or more PMOs set up, but what becomes really important then is that I understand what the overall vision is for the whole PMO setup, for that whole integrated PMO model. But actually, each of the individual PMOs that are spawned off that kind of overall piece have their own vision aligned to the integrated PMO vision, and the objectives and the key results area and the services are all very much aligned. So actually, I can see as the PMO, the head of PMO for the logistics department, I can say, I understand I've got 3 PMOs that sit across. One kind of sits at the program, one looks at a particular, kind of difficult project, and the other one kind of picks up all of the other projects and programs. We've worked out that's the best configuration for PMOs in this department. We understand exactly what all of the objectives are, and between us, we actually hit that overall vision that's been agreed with the stakeholders and the senior managers within the logistics department. And then what that allows me to do is do an aligned PMO service strategy, as we've just seen. So this is an example of an integrated PMO model from an enterprise perspective, where actually what I've got here is I recognize that we've got each individual PMO, and each individual PMO has their own service catalogue and their operations handbook. Now, however, what we've done is we've said, yes, we're going to have 4 PMOs across the organisation, but actually the enterprise PMO is going to be the primary home of the Centre of Excellence activities. So they're going to be the key people who have the overall services that sit across the organisation. And what each of the other PMOs do is have a subset of the service catalogue that's held at enterprise level. So we know that way, kind of when the construction PMO says, actually, we want to introduce some risk management services, they can go to the enterprise PMO and say, can we have your entry in of the service catalogue that you do for your customers? And then what we'll do is we'll have a look at the operations handbook, and we'll take what we can and reuse those within the construction PMO. So the enterprise PMO keeps a track of what services are being provided and understands what the potential variances are in terms of how they deliver that service and what might be different in their PMO, so that kind of the individual instructions in the handbook might differ. So what we've got is this kind of hierarchy of handbooks, but at any point we know exactly which of the individual PMOs are driving what particular service, because it may be, for example, that the IT PMO might be delivering a service that the enterprise PMO are not delivering. So it could be, for example, the IT PMO could be facilitating various sets of workshops. As the transformation PMO goes to the enterprise PMO and says, actually, I'm looking to start facilitating workshops, and we want to set that up as a formal service for our PMO, the enterprise PMO can say, well, actually, we don't deliver that service. I've got the outline details, but the detail of that is in the IT PMO. So what we're trying to do here is trying to avoid any kind of double counting or kind of trying to create the same service more than once, where we've got some kind of primary holders across the organisation. And without having that kind of integrated PMO services strategy, it becomes very difficult to do. Now, in order to be able to work at this level, there are a number of things that we need to have in place. We need to have a sponsor that sits at enterprise or organization level. And those people don't always exist in organizations. And so sometimes kind of trying to get this off the ground, there is lots of conversations about, you know, kind of empire building within the PMO. They're trying to kind of create this whole department, this whole function with a huge hierarchy and lots of officers. And actually, we still really don't understand what a PMO does. And so sometimes you can't actually start at that enterprise level. You do have to start at your departmental or divisional level. But what we sometimes find at even that departmental or divisional level, the senior management team don't necessarily have a view of what a PMO can do. And therefore, as a PMO person, what we have to do is start thinking about, actually, can we develop our PMO from a bottom-up perspective? So rather than kind of doing the top-down and that lovely holistic design with a kind of a shared service strategy, actually what we've got here is a department with two completely disparate PMOs, both having their own service catalogue and operations handbook, but actually they don't necessarily know what's in each other's handbook and have very little kind of collaboration between the two. And, you know, the first thing that we would advise is actually just go and start networking, actually go to say hello. And you'd be surprised at how many people don't actually network with the people who sit within the PMOs within their own organization. So there's some interesting ways in terms of, you know, kind of how do you find other PMO people in their organization? You know, and I've spoken to some people who didn't realize there was another PMO in their organization until they've seen a job advertised external to the organization and thought, well, actually, there's a job sitting there in the other part of the organization, and I didn't even know they had a PMO. Yes, and sometimes, you know, kind of we can find them just on our individual network. Sometimes we can go in and find from LinkedIn some other people who are sitting across our network. And so the first thing is to actually kind of just go and say hello and try and get to know the people across the PMO. And what we're trying to do here is just to try and do some knowledge sharing. We're not talking about kind of creating a kind of a composite PMO or kind of merging the PMOs at all, but just having some conversations and try to understand what each of those PMOs actually does. So this kind of sharing and knowledge and saying, well, actually, I'm thinking about putting in a new some change management processes because we're not very good at managing change. And actually, the other kind of group will say, do you know, we've already got something like that. And we can kind of start sharing that knowledge. Now, what we might find where we're doing this kind of bottom up is that some of the processes, some of the procedures don't fit because we've actually developed some different project management processes because we're sitting in different parts of the organization. But I've actually kind of done this on a global level with a number of kind of other PMO regions where we had three regions that were delivering projects, and each of our PMOs kind of did our own thing. But actually through collaboration, through those three PMOs, we were actually able to derive a number of standard processes which we could then integrate in our own PMOs over a period of time. So it's not a 5-minute job. It's not even a 3-month job. Yes, sometimes actually kind of creating that collaboration allows us first to kind of have a kind of that integrated kind of and oversight between the two PMOs, which may actually get us to be able to deliver a PMO service strategy where actually we just agree amongst ourselves where we're going to sit. Now that leads us on to being able to then start doing some of the things that actually that full integrated PMO model might use, because what we can then do is go back and start thinking about, well, actually, how can we align our metrics and our objectives so they don't necessarily dovetail into a single point because there's nobody in the organization who's potentially interested. But actually what we're doing is paving the way for being able to go and see the organization and say, well, actually, there is some benefit in being seen as a single function or department because there is a number of overlaps. And I think, to me, one of the kind of the real benefits of starting to kind of have those conversations is consistency of reporting and development of decision-making data that sits consistently across the piece that helps the organizations deliver better projects and programs. And actually what they'll see is the collaboration between the various PMOs will actually kind of drive them to perhaps look differently at the PMOs and start looking at that as a group rather than kind of disparate parts of the organization. So we are always happy to have a conversation with anybody who's feeling a bit stuck. We do offer both coaching as an individual perspective, but also we'll come and help coach your team. We are got some courses coming up in the next few weeks. We've got a P3O Foundation, which looks at a kind of pulling together a P3O model, which again is another way of calling it an integrated PMO model. We've got assurance for PMO professionals. If you go onto our website, that's currently on a 15% discount. And then we've got our House of PMO Essentials for analysts and managers coming up in July. If you think your training's not for you, but you want some individual support or some individual support for your team in implementing any of the things we've talked about, do get in touch and we'd be delighted to help. Thank you very much for coming on today. Hope we found it useful, and we're here to help.